Now let us come to our main issue, that is of the relationship between market structure and the innovation, effectively asking whether it is a competitive market or competitive industry which will motivate the firms to undertake innovation, or whether it is the industry where high monopoly power is now being enjoyed by the firm that will motivate the firms to invest in R&D. Whereby he has said that oligopolistic rivalry that he has been talking about is indeed something which is different from the price competition. It in fact relates to the novel products, or maybe doing things better, or identifying the unexplored market. Recall the discussion we had about the role of entrepreneurs in Schumpeter's creative destruction, whereby he said that an entrepreneur will be able to identify the opportunities presented in the industry, will be able to make use of them by going to the bank, taking credit, and will be able to now invest in the particular firm, which will be now disrupting the way the things are being done in industry. Later on, he has pointed out that this kind of a method through which change can be brought in is in fact limited. Not only that, once a particular firm has been established, there is a limit in terms of what all improvements can be brought onto that. If that is the case, essentially there are limits in terms of what an entrepreneur can do. So the potential, the growth potential of an entrepreneur is limited because of the limits on the improvement that can be introduced in the production method. If that is the case, how do you innovate? In that context, he has pointed out that over a period of a time, the process of innovation in fact has itself become routinized. That means there are different tasks which are engaged in innovation that needs to be performed. Firms have been able to identify them, create a division of labor, maybe a separate division of R&D within their particular firm, and being able to now do innovation in a very routine, specific way. If that is the case, he has given two major hypotheses. The hypothesis one is regarding the greater the market power of a firm or the firm which possesses, the greater is the incentive to engage in routinized innovation. Why? Because of the lessened possibility of monopoly rent being competed away. Here note that the focus of a large firm on innovation comes through essentially from the resources that they have in order to undertake the very extremely costly and large level of routinized innovation activity. Another point and the hypothesis which has been made in Schumpeter's work is that the large firms are more able to generate this kind of a routinized innovation due to their capacity to capture economies of scale. Now, these two hypotheses has been pointed out are the most researched, empirically investigated hypotheses in the history of industrial organization. So, let us talk about the first one. Here, I have already pointed out there are different models of perfect competition, monopoly, and within that also we have. So, what we will do, we will look at the incentive that a firm may have under monopoly. That is where the Schumpeterian hypothesis is coming into. And then we will see the kind of incentive that they will have under the perfect competition. Now, let us start with our basic model. So, what does the basic model tell? There is a single producer. There is a model for a monopoly now. So, what we have is a single producer or a seller. The single producer or seller essentially faces a negatively sloped demand curve. The demand curve which is being experienced is a negatively sloped. There is no potential for a market entry. We are talking about a monopoly situation. Q represents the quantity of good. Thus, CQ is effectively the total cost function. This is the inverse demand function. Demand function is written as in terms of your price here. So, what we are taking is an inverse demand function, and this is the profit function. The assumption that we have in this case is that the marginal cost that we will be talking about has to be increasing or has to be greater than or equal to the marginal revenue that will be generated. One can always question why is this condition being imposed. Once you will do the profit maximization, you will realize that this is your first order condition in order to get an optimal value of the profit. So, let us look at that. So, here first of all, how are we writing the profit? The profit is now being written as something which is total revenue minus the total cost. So, we already have our cost function, and then we have our inverse demand function with which we have multiplied our quantity. Now, in order to maximize this, what we will do, we will differentiate it with respect to Q. That is the output. Once we will differentiate it, what you will get is a term like this. This is a first order condition, and this has to be now equated to 0. Then you will get an equation like this: P plus Q into P prime Q equal to C prime Q. These are essentially the first order differentials. So this is what we get in the equation 1. If you now simply rearrange these terms, particularly on this side, and use this term, which is your elasticity of demand, price elasticity of demand, which effectively tells you the percentage change in the quantity demanded due to percentage change in the price. So we use this term and we do certain rearrangement in this term. Effectively what we will do here is, we'll take out the P, this term we multiply by P, divided by P, which is, this is already our P by dQ, like that, and then we use this and this, right? So from here, and we put the negative also here, so we get 1 minus 1 by price elasticity of demand, which now has been equated to the marginal cost. So do we have any condition on this elasticity? Yes, we do. Here you will see that from a monopolist point of view, it has to be, it will be greater than 1. And the idea here would be that the monopolist would be operating in the elastic part of the demand curve. If it is less than 1, then here you can see that there will be a certain concern. And then if you use this again, you will be able to find that the Lerner index can be equated to 1 upon elasticity. So here what we begin with, on the x-axis, that is here, we have Q, that is the output, and on the y-axis we have price. As we said earlier, the monopolist faces a downward sloping demand curve. And then we are able to get an MR. MR is essentially your marginal revenue, which is also your downward sloping. For the profit maximization, what you have to do is equate the, which is your profit differentiated with respect to Q. What you will get is a marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost. This is an important condition for the profit maximization, and we find that in this particular case the costs are constant. The cost that is being treated is rather constant. So we have the cost here. Let us first talk from a point of view of a monopoly. So we find this particular point where your cost is now, marginal revenue is equated to your marginal cost. Using this point, the monopolist is able to determine what level of output will be produced in the market. Now, having decided the output to be produced and sold in the market, going back to the demand curve, the monopolist will determine what price will be charged for this particular price, right? And then the monopolist will be able to get the total revenue, which is equal to OQM multiplied by OPM, so this entire total revenue that will be collected. And then after deducting the cost associated with that, the monopolist will be able to enjoy the producer surplus. So what is there? The producer surplus essentially we are using here because the producer knows its operating profit. Please note that there are rather huge costs which are engaged with the product development, or maybe in this particular case for the introduction of the newer process which might reduce the process. Now those kind of a cost are rather fixed in nature, right? So from the point of view of monopolist, this producer surplus that is now being enjoyed, it has to be greater than the fixed cost engaged in this particular case. Then and only then it will have the incentive to innovate. However, we are just now not going into a comparative analysis. This is a basic model which we are able to understand it. Let's go over quickly. So we have used the first order condition whereby marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost to determine the output that will be produced by the monopolist. Using that, monopolist is determining the price, and this blue area in this case is reflecting the producer surplus. Now, how this situation is going to be different from that of a competition, that is a perfect competition. Under a perfect competition, what we realize that at an industry level, there would be a price determination. So, if you look at an industry, there would be a demand curve of the industry, and then there would be a supply which is essentially coming from all the sellers who are there in the market. Now, depending upon the demand and supply conditions, the industry will determine the price. And that price will be now taken by the firm as given at P star. And they will determine and they will find out what level of output they will be supplying at that particular price. Note that in the long run, this price is then equated to the marginal cost. That is an important condition with respect to the perfect competition, whereby price becomes equal to the marginal cost. So that means the seller is able to get the price of that particular commodity, which is equal to the cost they are going to incur in order to produce that one more unit of output. Now let us move forward. Here, now we are taking a specific case of a duopoly. Now this duopoly case is that of a Bertrand duopoly. Now results have shown that in case of a Bertrand, let us begin with a case where you have a two producers or seller. Once again, you have a homogeneous product. And here, this is the demand function that has been given, right, where this particular condition we have already discussed. Now here, what you find is that there are identical and the constant average and marginal cost. Given that we are talking about the two producers in this particular market, the Bertrand model, here you will find out that both of them have identical cost and the constant average and the marginal cost. Now, in the equilibrium, it can be found that under a Bertrand competition, that the price which is being now charged is essentially equal to your marginal cost. The competition that happen among the duopolists, among the two producers under the duopoly, is based on the price competition. And under the circumstances that both the firms have unlimited capacity, that is to say that having determined the price, they will be able to produce as much as possible. The product that they are looking at is indeed homogeneous in nature, and it is a one-shot game. That essentially implies that there is no provision or a possibility for collusion. And under this assumption of identical and constant marginal cost and average cost, what we find is that the price which is being charged by the firm under a Bertrand, this I can be 1 to 2, is equated to their marginal cost. Since this is same, then once again it will be same for both the players. So essentially, through this Bertrand model, we are trying to understand what will happen in case of because since the outcome is very similar to the perfect competition, we will use this as a proxy to understand the motivation or incentive of the firm to innovate under the perfect competition. So let us first look at the objective profit function. This is again QI into PQI and your total cost. Now you are maximizing this and you get this kind of a result here. And the first order conditions are given by this. Now let us try and understand this diagrammatically. So in a Bertrand model, what you have is once again a demand curve which is coming from here. You also have your marginal curve, marginal revenue curve. Note that here also the demand curve is downward sloping. What we have assumed in the model earlier is that the marginal costs are constant and they are same for both the firms. Effectively here what we are saying that the solution would be such that both the firms will be charging PIB the same price at that particular cost. What would be the motivation for a firm in a Bertrand competition to innovate? Here, now we will make a comparison between the monopoly and the Bertrand competition also in terms of what happens with respect to the loss to the society. So under the Bertrand competition, if you look at it, here both the firms will have a zero economic profit. Right? So there is a zero economic profit. This entire area of the triangle PIB, let me call this point E, is essentially your consumer surplus. So this area is consumer surplus, essentially coming from the idea that the price which will be paid by the consumer is many times less than the price that they will be willing to pay. Right? So there is a difference between the payment actually made and the price that they are willing to pay, and based on that is what we calculate the consumer surplus. Consumer surplus is a very important measure which is used by the social planner in order to assess the impact or evaluate the influence of the different policies. So here what you find under the Bertrand competition, this entire area is referring to the consumer surplus, and each firm essentially makes a zero economic profit. So here, now let us compare those two situations with a monopoly. Now in case of a monopoly, what happens? We have now superimposed the first diagram which we did on this particular case, right? So this entire area of P naught, P star, and let me call it E, being the consumer surplus under the Bertrand competition, has now different portions here. What are the portions? Under the monopoly, we find that this is the output which the firm will decide to produce based on this particular point. Let me call it EM, and then the price which will be charged is somewhat here, right? So in this case, what would be the consumer surplus? Once again, the definition remains the same: below the demand curve and slightly above the prices. So this entire red area, this entire orangish area which you can see on the screen is indeed your consumer surplus. How do you compute this area of this triangle? That is given here, 1/2 into base into length, right? So you can calculate it by simple formula. Then what is the producer surplus which is coming to the monopolist? Is in this particular blue area. Now suppose I ask you to make a comparison between the welfare impact of a Bertrand competition vis-a-vis the monopoly. So what we have seen, this huge area of P star, E, P naught being the consumer surplus is now distributed into three areas. One is the consumer surplus, which is once again enjoyed by the consumers even under the monopoly, right? Even under the monopoly, they are enjoying that. However, it has reduced considerably. On the other hand, you have this blue area, which is effectively the PS. Now, what about this green area? This green area is what is being referred in the theory as a deadweight loss. Right? So, here what has happened, that once you have moved from the Bertrand competition to a monopoly, there is a reduction in the consumer surplus. Now, the reduction in the consumer surplus is some of it has been reallocated to the monopolist in the form of the producer surplus. However, still there is a loss to the society which is coming in the form of the deadweight loss. Where is this deadweight loss coming from? If you look at it, what you find is that the quantity sold has reduced from QB to QM. That means there were certain consumers who were able to have an access to that particular product before the price was rather PM, instead when it was P star. Now these consumers are driven out of the market, right? And this is essentially a loss to the society which is neither redistributed, and it in fact is of much concern from the point of view of the social planner. You can also calculate the area of the deadweight loss through this. Right, so you have to get these numbers. This you can get once you determine the quantity that will be supplied under competition, and this is the price under monopoly, and this is the price under competition. That difference can also be computed, and the area of this particular triangle can be very easily calculated. Now moving forward, so what are the reasons behind this deadweight loss? Essentially, the model assumes that the producer charges same price from each consumer. There is no discrimination. They either decide the price or quantity, but they cannot decide the both. And producer decisions purely will be based on producer surplus, not on the consumer surplus. And what we have seen in this particular setup is an allocative inefficiency. That means there is an undersupply as compared to the competitive structure. That also I pointed out. And the concern behind distribution also, there is a shift of the surplus from consumer surplus because of the market share. So here you see that this blue area, which initially belonged to the consumer, has now shifted to the monopolist. So now the question arises that there are static inefficiencies when we are talking from a monopoly point of view. The deadweight lost is essentially a loss, or you can say the cost which is imposed on the society for monopoly. And what would be the degree of this monopoly power? That we can also compute using the learner index. However, please note that here you have the monopolist has also individualized the producer surplus, which was not available under the Bertrand competition. If it is not available, that means now because of this availability of the resources, the monopolist may indeed have a certain amount of motivation to in fact invest in R&D. So what you have is a trade-off. What is the trade-off entails? It entails a tolerance of the static inefficiency. The static inefficiency is essentially coming from the deadweight loss and the dynamic efficiency which can be enjoyed because of the increase in the investment in research and development. However, that entire premise is based on the argument that the monopolist would be investing this amount in the innovation. So whether the monopoly actually help and support the innovation activity, it needs to be answered. So effectively, once again, we are at the same set of questions, but now I think you can look into these questions in much more deeper way, because you have now an understanding of what kind of gains are there when you are a monopolist, vis-a-vis the loss that you, if not the loss, in fact, essentially a firm under a competition who would be now making merely zero economic profit. Where will the resources come from? And is having that kind of market power is a prerequisite? And who will invest in R&D? And so we will revisit this, we will find an answer to these questions using the basic model which we have done so far. So now let us ask the question again. What is the incentive to innovate for a firm, that is only firm which undertakes R&D? Against the basic framework which we have already seen, we will now make certain more assumptions to find an answer to that question. First of all, we are looking here at a process innovation. Process innovation, as we have discussed in detail, essentially entails reduced unit cost due to the discovery of the new technology. If you recall, we have also made a distinction between drastic and non-drastic one, and we will prove the results for both the drastic as well as for the non-drastic change in the process innovation. Then we will look at then the model will consider two market structure, monopoly and Bertrand duopoly, essentially because under the Bertrand duopoly the results are same, that of the perfect competition. Drastic innovation will effectively mean that your cost has fallen so much that it will lead to, let us say something here, so that the new price which will be charged, it will be in fact lower than the cost which was there earlier, something like this. So a drastic innovation, what does K prime mean? The price which will be charged when the cost of production is by K prime let us say if a monopoly price that will be charged. This is the monopoly price to be charged when once again the K prime is a new cost. If it is greater than K, then we are talking about a non-drastic innovation. If it is less than K, then we are talking about the drastic innovation. So first let us understand within the non-drastic case. So here what you have seen is once again the demand function, which is your PQ, and your marginal revenue, and the K, which is representing your cost. On x-axis we have output, on y-axis we have the prices, and once again the determination of the output and prices in the monopoly, and the producer surplus which is being enjoyed by the monopolist. This is without the new technology. Now let us say the new technology comes into picture. Once again you will see that with the new picture you have to, with the new technology you have to now find out once again the point for where your marginal cost is equated to marginal revenue. That is the point now in this case is here. Based on that, to determine the output that will be produced by the monopolist under K prime cost. Accordingly, you will find that the price which will now be charged is around PMK prime. Now here, if you see this red area, orangish area, the orange area is indeed the price producer surplus under the new technology. So this is once then a non-drastic innovation has been introduced, you see that the producer surplus of the monopolist actually increases. However, that increase in the producer surplus also comes with the price. What is the price? The monopolist indeed has to now reduce the price. One can always question that why is it that the monopolist is reducing the price? He or she is the monopolist. They can simply go with the same price. Please note, the reduction in the price comes from the condition that we have a downward sloping demand curve. If you have a downward sloping demand curve and if you want to now sell more units of the output in the market, essentially it would mean that you have to reduce the price. That means with the reduction in the price, the consumers are now able to enjoy the consumer surplus. So this entire area which was, let us say, like this slanted line, that was the consumer surplus, has now been increased. The increase in fact include this blue area as well as this small triangle, right? But this blue area was earlier belonging to the monopolist. So that means now with the new technology, the monopolist has something to lose, right? And also something to gain. So what is the something to gain? The something to gain is now coming here in this orangish area. So clearly, monopolists, when they innovate and come up with even a technology which is non-drastic, you will find that there will be a certain amount of giving from their part and certain amount of gaining from that point. So now let us analyze this in a deeper detail. So this green area now is lost due to the introduction of the new technology. Whereas now this deepened color or the deep orange is indeed the incentive to innovate, right? So once again, the incentive to innovate is now being created here. Where that incentive to innovate come? Essentially from the gains in the profit or the gains in the producer surplus. But what we find is that these gains do not accrue or happens to the monopolist without any losses, and that loss is this green particular area. So we have to now make an adjustment for that. Essentially this red area or the deep orange area minus the green area that you have will give you the motivation for the monopolist to invest in R&D. So now let us look at the incentive to innovate under the Bertrand duopoly. So here what you find is that particularly in case of a non-drastic innovation, what will happen? The cost of production has come down. The cost of production has come down from K to K prime. That is because of the introduction of the new technology. So what do you find in this case now? This was the price which was being charged by both the sellers in this market. This was the quantity which was being supplied. Now the price has come down. However, if you look at it, even with this new process innovation, will it be possible for the Bertrand seller to behave like a monopolist? The answer to that is no, because what we are experiencing is a non-drastic innovation. What does it mean? It means, now let us say this particular seller who has now come up with this new technology which has reduced its cost wants to behave like a monopolist. What he or she will do? First we'll find out this particular point which is MC is equal to MR and determine the output to be produced. and then look at the price to be charged, right? Now in this case, clearly the price that is to be charged is much higher than the price which is being already charged by the other seller. They will not be able to displace the other seller in this market even with this particular process innovation. Then what are their options? Their options are very simple. The option of this seller is to continue to produce and sell at QBK, right? So they will be able to get K as a price and they will be selling this much amount of good in the market. But what they will be enjoying is this particular yellow area. What is this now yellow area in this case? You can say the producer surplus for an innovating firm under the Bertrand duopoly, when only one firm innovate. Please remember an important assumption that only one firm is innovating in this particular case. So now, if we want to make a comparison between these two circumstances, we have to compare this yellow area with the area, that red area minus the green area for the monopolist. Now let us do that. So this is a case of limit pricing because no change in the prices by duopoly firm. As I have shown you, it is not possible because the existing price is already much lower in the market, and so there is no change in the consumer surplus. It remains like that. The only gain which happens is the gain of the producer surplus by the innovating firm. And if cost of innovation is now less than the yellow shaded rectangle, then there will be a motivation for the firm to innovate. Note that only one firm is innovating. If both will try to innovate, then what will happen? Both will come to K prime. Once again, the perfect competition effectively will attain that the price will fall to K prime, and if they would be now charging, not left with any profits. So now let us make a comparison between the incentive to innovate under monopoly and under a Bertrand competition. So this was the profit, gain and profit loss. What was the gain? The gain was essentially this. So you have to basically find out the area of this and then subtract this to get the number and compare this with this whole area. So this area is indeed, the blue one which I am marking is indeed common, right? So then just to make a fair comparison, we have to compare this area, the one where I am putting the slide, vis-a-vis this area, right, minus this area. So clearly competition has more incentive. Here you can see that given the demand and the supply conditions which are same, let us say, if the demand conditions are same and the cost conditions which we are looking at are also same, if the demand conditions are same, here you will find that very clearly that this area of this particular rectangle is rather large as compared to the area of this rectangle. So there will be a motivation with the Bertrand producer to actually go ahead and undertake innovation. One can very clearly ask and question that it may not be the case that it will be this area would be larger than that. So how do we go about that? So we will do the formal mathematical analysis for that. But before that, let me talk about that why is it in this circumstance we find that the motivation for the monopolist is rather low. Here, please note that the monopolist was already making certain profit. When they introduced a new technology, even in the form of a non-drastic innovation, what happened? They were still making profit. Now that profit, there was certain portion was related to it. It was same, but it also ate away into the existing profits, right? So this green area then becomes extremely important. Since they were already making profit and something is now being taken away from the monopolist, you will find that the incentive of the monopolist has now been reduced. We will have more discussion on this particular point as we go along.